My conversation today is with scholar and author Tobias Churton. Having produced works on the history of Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, Gnosticism, and sundry other of similar ilk, which have become modern classics, as well as a recently published work on the books of Enoch, Churton is considered among the great scholars of the Western esoteric traditions. We sat down to discuss his entry into the academic study of the esoteric, the meaning of occultism, the inherent secrecy of the spiritual life, pitfalls of the modern age, and much more. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanum Podcast. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to have Tobias Churton with us today on the Arcanum Podcast. I am ready to go. My cup of coffee is full, and thank you for being here so much.
It's a great pleasure to speak to North Carolina.
Yeah. So you cover a lot of ground in your general oeuvre, which is fairly large at this point, and you are definitely one of the most trusted voices in the fields of Western esoteric traditions, and you've helped bring it to wider audiences. But I'm interested, and I'm sure some of my listeners are today, to know what exactly brought you to the study of esotericism specifically. I understand it wasn't this very popular field when you began your studies. Is that correct?
When I became interested in it, it was virtually non-existent. When I first went to Oxford, I was asked, would I like to do a dissertation instead of a paper? And I said, yes, I'd like to do an original dissertation. And I said, I'd like to study magic and the Old Testament. And this caused some consternation. And about a week later, I was told that it was impossible to do this because the last person who'd written on the subject was about 1900. And there was nobody who could mark my dissertation to the level. So that rather depressed me. So I was stuck with pretty well studying Orthodox church history, the Hebrew scripture and the New Testament. So I didn't get as much joy out of the subject when I was at college, but I became more aware of it as time went on. I don't know where this interest in magic came from. I think it was just I was writing poetry from a fairly early age. And I think I was very much the romantic person. I loved anything that was from the past. I loved history, ancient history particularly. I had a strong feeling as I was growing up in the 1960s and the 70s that valuable insights into human being were being tossed away in a rush towards the modern. And I rejected the modern. I didn't like modern things. I liked things that had some depth, some past, some history. And I'm also romantic. I think with my heart, and not only my heart, but very much I respond to music, poetry, and inner rhythms of things. I'm always looking beneath the surface, and I think the most important things are generally invisible. So I'm against the opacity of the world. So those sensibilities of music and poetry, I think, probably led me to a feeling that maybe the idea of magic, which was dismissed completely in my education, may have something to it. And obviously the kind of films I liked always had a magical element. I do think cinema itself, just as a phenomenon, has reignited the idea of the magical. And it is one of the few enchanted places left, until you start to discover places that are unspoilt in the world. England has quite a lot of them, Wales and so on, but also there are parts of the world that have a magical quality. I respond to that. For me, nature is not about physics. It's about a creative mind that's been expressed in it. And so, as the psalmist and the Proverbs say, the heavens declare the glory of God, and His works. We see the Spirit of God in His works. And if we lose sight of that, I believe we've lost sight of any meaning that we can have in life. So I went up to Oxford, as one does, in search of knowledge. I found a lot of facts, but not a lot of what I'd call knowledge. And I became aware, usually by a kind of series of accidents, became aware of a few books would suddenly, I remember seeing a book called by Frances Yates, who funnily enough was at Oxford when I was there, and I didn't know I could have gone to see her. I wish I had. Dame Frances Yates. She was the only academic writer in England at the time with a university position writing on Hermetic philosophy. And she'd done a little book called on the Elizabethan occult, the occult, I can't remember the exact title, but it was a follow-on from her book on Giordano Bruno, which was a very fine book and introduced the idea of Hermetic philosophy in a newly vivid or recovered form. And she raised the Titanic of Hermeticism through her writing. She may have gone too far with some of her books. Her book on the Rosicrucian Enlightenment is really outdated now and would be very, very, very unwise to base anything serious on her contention that the Rosicrucian manifestos stem from an English John Dee source, which has gone into the mainstream, but really doesn't hold water. But the important thing is she took them seriously, and practically nobody else did, unless they were members of a magical order, like a Golden Dawn spin-off, or the Order of the Inner Light, which was founded by Dion Fortune, or Violet Firth, as her real name was. And of course, the Crowleyan, the great Crowleyan connection. I just remembered something very important in this. I remember I used to go to London with my mother during holidays, whether school holidays or college holidays. And I remember I always had a strong attraction to the British Museum. And we were walking around the streets around the British Museum one summer, I think it was summer 79, I think. And there was this bookshop called the Atlantis Bookshop, specializing, it said, in occult, magic, mythology. And I felt the most extraordinary magnetism to this very forbidding looking shop. This was not a place that seemed to want you to go inside it. And I was looking at the books in the window, and a friend of mine had lent me a book by Aleister Crowley, his so-called Confessions of Aleister Crowley. And I'd read that during a holiday and was very impressed by the writing. And there was some of this Crowley stuff, which I remember in my local library, the only two Crowley books had stamps on them saying you must never take them out the library, and they were not to be read by anybody under 18. So naturally one was interested. But anyway, I said, well, Mum, if you'll go into this shop, I'll come in with you. So we crossed the threshold and we went inside, and there was a very old chap, it might have been Michael Horton or his successor, who got the shop going in the 1920s. So I doubt if it was Michael Horton, the original founder of the shop. But there was a fellow there, and he seemed to look askance at the fact that we dared to come into the shop. Anyway, I wasn't easily put off. And so I looked around the shelves, and there was a book called Crowley on Christ, and by Crowley, actually, with an introduction by Francis King. It was a small publisher. It was relatively new book. You can't get it in that form anymore. I know that. But the fact that I was doing a theology degree, I thought, well, this is the first book I've seen that brings together the idea of Christology and magic. So I asked, my mother bought it for me, and I read it with enormous interest, and I found Crowley's viewpoint refreshing, logical, very funny, and really quite useful, because I took it back to college and challenged my tutors with some of the points that he was making. I think that was so. Yes, there was the Crowley concept that brought me in, the Francis Yates, the Hermetic philosophy. Oh, and of course, one cannot forget the beginnings of the Rennes-le-Château mystery, which stemmed in Britain in 1976 when Michael Bajan, my old friend, researched the story of Saunière and all that. And I'd always had this kind of inner connection with the idea of some secret society. Or my grandfather was a Freemason. I was always fascinated by his regalia, which he kept in his surgery, with all the implements he used for cutting up. He was a chiropodist, and he was always slicing something off people's feet. And next to the various dermatomes and scraping things he'd had, there would be his Royal Arch regalia. And the combination, the physical and the sort of metaphysical, was always, with the smell of detergents and medicines, was kind of interesting. And Dad and Granddad had an extraordinary life. He'd been at Imphal and Kohima, which was the last bastion to keep the Japanese out of India. The battle, he was in the battle for that as a medic. And wow. He'd seen some terrible things happen in front of his eyes. And obviously, if you're a medic in the army in a major battle, you're going to see some stuff. And it's going to change the way you... But he took it very well. But I was fascinated how he maintained his reason and at the same time involved himself with Freemasonry and so on. That was a little bit of interest. My parents were rather offbeat compared to other parents. They're not materialistic. They're both very romantic. They met on a bus and married 6 weeks later. My father was always introducing me to new ideas, and he took me to many different churches, and I had a taste of all kinds of religious expression. So I was open-minded. I wasn't brought up in one tradition at all, and I wasn't forced into one tradition. I was encouraged to use my mind and read, and I liked reading, and so yes, I think that should give you a pretty good beginning.
Yeah.
There's kind of things that stirred my interest early on. The interesting thing was I became aware very quickly at college and afterwards that there was no way to find in England then, and probably in America, I'm sure, in late 1970s, there was, unless you joined a magical order, which did not have a lot of academic status, shall we say, and you were never quite sure how trustworthy. I mean, I remember writing to Amorg, Spencer Lewis's organization based in Pasadena, and they sent me all this material, and I just thought, I don't believe this. I don't believe this order was founded in ancient Egypt. I don't believe I'm going to learn how to telepathically communicate with somebody 1,000 miles away just because I want to. I found the claims of some of these orders too far-fetched and too forbidding, and so I pursued my own path. But I was very interested. I knew that in this tradition was vital knowledge to combat materialism, which I regard as the great enemy of our culture and of humankind throughout history. When the prophets in the Hebrew writings make such a fuss, to say the least, about idolatry, they're talking about what we'd call today materialism. Now, materialism to me does not mean I like having a car or I enjoy the physical things of life. Materialism is the idea that the physical and the visible are the essence of existence, and biological reality is the total reality of the human being, and the mind is an expression of brain matter, and this sort of thing. That's materialism. The forbidding of worship of idols was because people mistaking an image for spiritual reality. And this has always been a fault of human beings. We forget the God who made us, and we end up worshipping an image of God. Now, that image might be God-like, it might be an idea of God. I think we worship ideas of God, and they're just as dangerous as totem poles. In fact, I would say a totem pole may be less dangerous, to say the least. You know, if you had some remembrance in your village that there was a God, perhaps, as long as you don't actually worship the wood or the stone, I don't see anything wrong with, particularly with images associated with religion. And I think the iconoclast who's afraid of all representation of religious ideas is missing the point. It is the degree to which you mistake spiritual substance for organic matter. There is a relationship, but the essence of our search is not immediately visible. And that's why we use the word occult. It means it's hidden from the eyesight. It's not deliberately hidden out of some conceited secret society thing. We must keep it a secret. The spiritual things are hidden from people because they don't see them. They could be right in front of their face. They could be living on the verge of realization, but they just don't get it. And if they don't get it, they don't see it. And it's hidden and it's a secret. And the materialist is always very nervous about other people having secrets that they don't know. But the secrets of the spiritual life are only available to those in a state to receive them.
Wow, that was extremely eloquently said. Actually, I kind of want to get up and dance after hearing that. I
Feel
talk.
free.
Nobody wants to see that. Well, on a similar tack, I've sort of leaned on a lot of your work. I cite it because it has that reliability without being sort of couched in this, as you say, materialist or positivistic sort of, in terms of scientific materialism sort of vernacular. It's very, you do get that sense from your writing that you don't, if you're a practitioner, if you're a believer of sorts, your books don't make you feel silly for believing. They don't have this disparaging finger wagging sort of tone. And so I see in academic institutions, particularly nowadays, there's sort of this very obviously analytical, granular approach to the study
Yes,
of.
I think a lot of the people, a lot of my experience, having been a lecturer at university on this subject, let's say some of the people who enter this subject enter it, shall we say, for the wrong reasons, and they just want to show off. I think there's a lot of that in it. Also, there's nothing pleases the modern type of how can I say, kind of academic commando than to debunk something or to show the
Right.
baseless of it. My aim is always to try and understand what I'm studying, and if I cannot understand it, I leave it alone. And if I have got somewhere with it, I want to communicate that in as plain, as good, disciplined English as I possibly can. I'm interested in the truth of it, and that's what motivates me to write at all. My ancestor Ralph Churton said, "The only thing worth contending for is the truth. That's the only thing worth a fight over. If the truth is at stake, that's what we're looking for." And when we're talking about matter spiritual, which is the divine life in the universe, which is the subject matter of magic, traditionally, I think, and of course of much religion, you have to be extremely interested in the truth, and you shouldn't start saying things when you just don't know.
Yes.
I'm quite attracted to Gordian knots, and I try to unravel things that have become obscure. I don't think the subject of Gnostic subjects are nearly as obscure as the way they've been written about. And I think they are comprehensible to an honest and disciplined mind. But obviously there are different levels of appreciation. No, I agree with you. I think there are people writing about what is currently called Western esotericism, a very, very unhappy term, in my opinion. I was not one of the inventors of it, I can assure you. But there are a lot of people writing on this subject who want to turn it very much into a typical academic subject. One of the and treat it in this tediously, overly footnoted, referential. All they end up doing is writing about what other people have written. It's really astonishing. The endless citation of some twit's latest paper. Anybody can write a paper, but if you get your paper in a particular journal, by God, you're an authority. You know, you have to be cited, and they simply ends up arguing amongst themselves. I mean, this is slowing the whole process of understanding down. One of the great things about when I started was, of course, this academic aspect didn't exist at all. So you had the people who were attracted to the subject were personally attracted and took risks in being interested. And there were sort of risky elements. I mean, if you're going to study magical psychology, you better be on your toes. It's not a subject to be entered in lightly. You ought to have, frankly, a kind of calling for it. I think an inner calling, and not deceive yourself that you have one. We're all prone to self-deception. You know, I tried to get away from the subject in a way, as a teenage rebel will try to get away from his or her parents. Or the way all human beings rebel against God, however you conceive the meaning of that expression. We do want to escape very much from the things that call us the most deeply. When you first fall in love, it's a bit dangerous. You know, you might take, I'm not going there. That's too big a risk. You know, and how many love stories are really about getting over that resistance to love, fear of it, the fear of love. I mean, it's the fear. Paul Simon's song "I Am a Rock" is very good on that, isn't it? If you don't fall in love, you don't get hurt. You know. So, but we do learn through certain kinds of suffering. There's no doubt about that. Now, academic writing takes all the suffering and the feeling, frankly, out of the subject. And this isn't a subject that should be treated in a how is it? Not forensic. I'm looking for another word.
Sterile.
In a sterile manner. A lot of the understanding of this subject is intuitive, absolutely intuitive, and I've always wanted to present the subject in such a way that to encourage the intuitive power of the reader to feel their way through it using their own mind. I don't want to tell people what to believe. That's the one thing I don't want to do. I do not wish to evangelize.
Right.
Just open a door if I can, or even a little bit open, and let some light in. And if the person is looking for the light, they'll go with it. And in that sense, I mean, I try to be. I don't try. I am conscious of academic discipline, but I'm not overwhelmed by it.
Right. Well, and I think one of the most interesting points is your immersion and involvement in poetry, I think early on, and music. You know, you mentioned that right out of the gate. And the thing is,
magic.
Right. These things help. I have found, you know, some of my favorite writers on the subject, some of my favorite practitioners on the subject are musicians and poets, because you're engaging with the world in a sort of, I want to say maybe supra-rational kind of interface. It's not.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
So
Definitely.
that's got to help you in some way, I think, really understand this.
Yes, what William Blake calls the poetic genius, which transcends the ruach. If we understand ruach in the Western concept of reason, rationation. Yes, well, of course, all Western intellectualism is entirely rationally based, or thinks it is, likes to think it is. and we have these three categories in the esoteric so-called world of, to use a Kabbalist term, we have nefesh and ruach and neshama, and different mystical writers will emphasize different aspects of these things. But basically, reason has its place, but it needs to know its place. You cannot compose a symphony based on logic alone. You can compose something that sounds like a symphony on logic alone. You can, of course, you can program a computer to follow some set rules, but you are not going to touch somebody's inner spirit at all with that. You may entertain with it. It's what John Lennon used to make the distinction between inspired writing and what he called craftsmanship writing.
Yes, this is actually, I was reading the Phaedrus just the other day, and a line struck me, and it's ringing a bell in my head now, where Socrates tells Phaedrus, a poet cannot enter the temple of the muses by art. The muses have to enter him first. He can't do it by skill, by techne. He has
Yes,
to do it by inspiration.
Yeah, that's the thing. You'd have to, for a modern audience, you'd have to specify what he meant by art. He meant the kind of artistry of the fake magician, or
Right.
the technique, as you say,
Yes.
merely by technique. No, you're absolutely right. This is true, and it's one of the reasons that the subject we're describing is resented by the materialist rationalist or neoliberal conceit attitudes, which have divided so many people in the modern world, and has made extreme political expressions more attractive because they appear to let loose on the you can have too much intuition, as it were. It's no good going from one extreme to another. The balanced person has a place for the three realms of the physical, the soul, and the spirit need to be harmonized. You can't split them apart. They're not really three separate worlds at all. They're all part of God's self-expression, if you like. But there is a tendency these days, if you don't like one thing, it means you must like another. And the democratic system, which is basically a binary system, makes that even more extreme. So why are we different to them? We don't believe in that. Well, yeah, that may not be true. I may believe some of that. I may be sympathetic to some of that. Why do I have to choose one or the other? If a wise person doesn't operate in that binary extreme sense, like supporting a football team or
Right.
Only the Dodgers count,
Yeah. I got to put on my political party jersey.
Probably better not to. I am fascinated. This is by the by of what you want to talk about, but I am becoming a bit more interested in is what the relationship is between spiritual thinking and political thinking. Dion Fortune wrote a very good book back in the 1920s advising her followers, magicians or practitioners of Kabbalah, that to keep out of politics completely, she said, it's the absolute corruption of the magician, because the magician thinks he's got the answers. The magician believes very strongly in a higher world, and he or she may be tempted to think that politics may be a means to affect this ideal world. And she advises strongly against it. She said it will lead to a confusion of planes and the wastage of the energy. And I'm interested in that because I have noticed recently that certain, should we say, broadly occult ideas are festering, sort of bubbling around certain kinds of political expression in the world. I'm not going to be specific or where, but one's becoming aware of it. It almost makes you wish for the cool, uncommitted, because going in the other direction can, of course, be hideously dangerous. There's no doubt about that. This is the thing about a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and it's one of the reasons why spiritual knowledge used to be guarded very closely. And I've had to ask myself at certain times, should you publish this, Toby? Is it going to be misunderstood? Could it fall into the wrong hands? What's this going to do in the mind of such and such a person? Is it going to, if their ego is naturally inflammable or highly inflatable, if that person thinks they've grasped some great universal truth and they glue it to their ballooning ego, this creates a kind of godlike delusion in the individual. And you see it all the time. It's why in Crowley's system, what he called destroying the ego was the big part of it. Unfortunately, that concept itself has gone too far. You saw that in the 1960s with people blowing their minds, literally blowing their minds with the idea that Charles Manson believed there was some kind of quick way with LSD and sex to blast the egos out of his followers. And the end result was, as we know, was a bunch of little murderers. You know.
Well,
but we're getting off the subject in a way, but I do try to, all this stuff we're talking about has a relevance to the world we're living in now.
Yes, absolutely. And it's important to bring this stuff up, right? Because then, you know, there are still modern applications, right? And to look at these things and sort of bifurcate them academically into these, you know, antique time periods is to sort of completely extricate them from their modern day context, which is what is important and practicable to us. But that said, and kind of dovetailing with the topic of division versus unity, one of the things that I find, and I'm very interested to know your thoughts on this, or at least to get you to express them, I do see that in this disconnect in area from area as these philosophies of antiquity are being studied more widely in academia. I talk to academics regularly. Many of them are my friends. I have a great admiration and affection for them, but I disagree with them when they compartmentalize these subjects too much and will not discuss the interconnectivity of things like Neoplatonism, Hermetism, Gnosticism. I see I see truly an ontological and existential dilemma that is working itself out through the philosophies and practices of these traditions. I'd like to know your thought on that.
Well, you initiated all sorts of lines of thought. The first thing is, yes, well, of course, academe thrives on specialization and analytical thinking. Analysis means literally to split apart, analusis, to loose apart, which is useful as a tool to try and understand, say, how a thing works. But as I remember my dad once buying a car and taking the entire thing to pieces because he didn't quite trust it, and then basically lost the will halfway through to put it back together again. So we ended up with a broken car lying around the backyard for years. And I think that's what happens to subjects when they're overly analyzed. Yes, all these words, Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, they're only of limited value to maybe specify certain kinds of thought. But as you rightly say, the essence of the thought that's running through them is universal. And if you try to say, well, what is the Hermetic philosophy? If you wanted to put it in one word like Wittgenstein or something, you'd be an absolute loss, because it's a combination of insights presented through a particular kind of lens at a particular time. I happen to like the 14 books of the Corpus Hermeticum, the Philosophical Hermetica, because there is a great charm in the way they've been written, which is quite unique in the whole canon. But as you just mentioned, Phaedrus and also the Phaedo are wonderfully written, Platonic, by Plato, wonderful descriptions of how the eternal relates to the temporal. If you're saying, well, what do they have in common? These things, I think they are trying to open up the human being to the cosmos and the spiritual cosmos, particularly. And in that sense, we're talking like kind of jnana yoga, not a knowledge discipline to unify the human mind with the divine. Now, that is a universal experience of human beings, some human beings, and has been so for, we can say certainly for some 3,000 years, and probably more than that. If you think that Akhenaten was functioning in about 1375 BCE, we don't know when this capacity to objectify a relationship between man and God began. We just don't know. We imagine that something like it has always been since the days of cave painting. To then say that, well, that philosophy should be called this, or it belongs there, or it's that. My work has very much gone to the extent of now, and in my book on the pillars, lost pillars of Enoch, right. I say really, we are in a position, and I certainly feel in a position to show that all the great religious traditions have this same thing in their esoteric, so-called esoteric side. You have Sufism in Islam, you have Kabbalah in Judaism, you have Christian mysticism and Hermeticism and Platonism in the Christian tradition. I would say Platonism is the philosophy of Christianity, quite honestly. If you take Platonism out, I don't see you've got much left, let's put it that way. And in the polytheistic tradition, you have also Hermetic philosophy and general magical traditions. And in animism, you also have the notion of a universal power manifest in nature. So, what are we saying is how to unify the human mind with the divine in a creative and recovering sense. We're talking about trying to. There is a fundamental philosophy in all of these traditions, which is that man has lost this union with God and needs to rediscover it. I think that's in all of these traditions. There is I'm trying to think of the word, apokatastasis, which is the restoration of a broken image of man. And we can use little myths like, if you imagine that man originally mirrored God, face to face, as it were. And this mirror, through man's falling into greater depth of materialism, has shattered. And we are trying to reassemble the parts of that mirror so we get a better image of the ultimate truth. That is fundamental. If you're talking about what we're talking about, that is true to all the traditions you've mentioned, that is very much part of it. Magic is too general a word to refer to a philosophy. Magic as a discipline, or if that's the right word, or an art, or a practice, has always been prepared to take a bit from here and a bit from there and a bit from there, because magic is usually it's man in his scientific basis. In other words, he's looking for practical results. If he thinks that if he can somehow invite or placate a power, then he can get something overturned and changed that he wants to change. Magic is about trying to get changes. So science, as far as I'm concerned, comes under the rubric of magic. But I mean that in the sense of the Magi, who are the scientists of Media and Persia. And it's the kind of the practical wing of what might otherwise be a contemplative exercise. But the fact is, I would like it to be understood that the fact is that all of this knowledge is one thing. I don't go for this any more than you do. Putting everything in a drawer and trying to systematize it, you lose the sense of the whole picture. Now, how many human minds can deal with the whole picture? Well, we can't. The very word panic is based on the horror and terror of having an experience of the all Pan, the God Pan, means the all, is everything. So people would go to a certain place in a wood maybe, or a place, and suddenly get this terror, this feeling of something so vast it's overwhelming. Well, that is man's position in the universe. If we were completely open to it, if we've stripped of all our very natural and proper defenses, we would be, oh my Christ, we're going to be absolutely overwhelmed. So we can't approach knowledge of the universe all in one go. When we talk about the wholeness of this knowledge and that it all connects and everything, we can only deal with it in certain kind of slices, but we mustn't forget that it is there, even though we can't consciously grasp it all the time. Maybe consciousness is overrated as a means of knowing. Maybe there are other dimensions of knowing which don't involve what we consider consciousness. I don't know. I genuinely don't know the answer to that. But I do think there are times when we probably overrate the idea of consciousness. It's very interesting if you think of the Genesis myth of Adam and Eve, consciousness is immediately associated with loss. It is the loss of Eden, the loss of the harmony with God, that it was manifested in him, of man becoming conscious of being separate and naked and exposed. And it is consciousness that leads to his leaving the garden. So whereas in modern science, for example, the more conscious you are of a certain thing, then you consider yourself in a more positive place. It may be that consciousness is a bit like, we should think also in terms of the word paranoia, that consciousness might be a fear reaction as well as an advantage. I'm just throwing that in as an idle speculation.
Yeah, brilliant though. I mean, wonderful things to think about, because it kind of bucks the general tack of things, and that's, I think, where,
yes.
well, that's where breakthroughs happen, for people, for listeners. Somebody might have just had like an aha moment on their drive to work. So, thank you very much. But I wanted to touch a little bit on Gnosticism, because it's something that you've written about, I think, very successfully. It's another subject kind of in vogue right now. Within broader communities of occultism and etc., esotericism, it's kind of used as a catch-all for maybe a rugged sort of fringe esotericism that dances around the term gnosis, but we have actual kind of, I guess it's an academic appellation, but Gnostic sects like the Mandaeans in Iran that have been there for a very long time and have something pretty formalized. I mean, it's a religious tradition.
Iraq. Not
So, what do you Iraq, right? So what are your thoughts on a meaningful approach, maybe, to the term gnosis and Gnosticism? I know you said that these terms aren't good for much, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on specifically gnosis.
Well, as practically, well, maybe everyone realizes, just the Greek for knowledge. It tends to be used in a special way in the so-called Gnostic Gospels as a means of salvation. And it is a useful cover word for some of the movements that emerge through the history of early Christian church in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries. The notion is that Jesus didn't only give moral advice, but that he imparted awareness, an illumination, an opening of the minds and souls and spirits of his followers, and that this was the most precious thing that he could leave. I think if we talk about gnosis then as a form of illuminative liberation, then the word gnosis is important in late antiquity as that word. But I personally think that liberation had always been available to some people, and it's very difficult to put a date on these things, because a lot of our dating is guesswork. I mean, you have a big problem when you try to date the Hindu scriptures, for example, because I think the oldest manuscripts only go back to what we would call in the West the Middle Ages, And it's very hard to know when they were written exactly, but we estimate we're talking mostly the first millennium BCE. But jnana yoga as a concept anyway, whether it came from the East to the Middle East and then to the West, or the other way around, which is perfectly possible. I think you're talking about this knowledge of union, jnana yoga, the union with God through knowledge, as opposed to, say, union with God through devotion. Now, I think devotional techniques, which are very popular in the great religions, are very, very powerful ways of bringing people into an awareness of God. The idea of knowledge is that there's actually been a cognitive change, that the reasoning powers have been illuminated by this experience, not simply the behavior or the moral commitment of a person. So in that sense, this idea that salvation is the achievement of gnosis has its validity. Gnosticism is just a scholar's phrase for what was considered a heresy in the early church. Now, it's obvious that gnosis was bigger than Christian heresy, because we know that there were non-Christian Gnostics, there were Jewish Gnostics, and I think you can use the word Gnostic in terms of Sufism and in terms of Zen. In the Zen form of Buddhist awareness, that seems to me to be thoroughly Gnostic, i.e. it's about an experience of transformative or liberating knowledge. So yeah, I think these are all useful. I think the rediscovery that there is a gnosis in Christianity is terribly important in America, and should be more important in Europe. If there were enough people interested seriously in this subject in Europe. But unfortunately, the European religious scene has been so historically dominated by the divide between Catholic and Protestant. That's right. That the Gnostic voice is hidden there and is basically now belongs to the esoteric, which is why in periods of revolution, this esoteric aspect always starts to come out. You see it in the late 18th century in France. You see it in Germany, also in the late 18th century. You saw it in Britain when we had our revolution period under Cromwell. You get the esoteric comes out, and now in the post-60s, we're getting the esoteric coming out again. It's the hidden. It's always been there, this Gnostic component, but in the status quo situation, it's very much repressed. Now, I think for Americans particularly to rediscover or discover, for many of them the first time, that there is a Gnostic Christian interpretation which unites the experience with Hindu mysticism, with Islamic mysticism, with Native American mysticism, where does it end? We find, in fact, we're talking about a universal spiritual experience. We shouldn't cheapen any of the traditions by lumping them and say, oh, they're all the same. They're not all the same. There are very great difference in emphasis. Also, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's been far more intellectual effort gone into interpreting these conditions. Also, if you speak to a Hindu philosopher, you will see that there's enormous amount of philosophizing that's gone on. Where people are thinking about spiritual experiences, and they end up in states of mind where you'll get a division within a spiritual school between one philosophy of it and another philosophy of it. You find exactly the same in Buddhism. When you let the philosophers loose, there will always be war. I don't mean guns necessarily. I just mean philosophers tend to think that their thoughts are determinative. And this may go back to my earlier criticism of implied criticism of consciousness. It may be that we take our thoughts about things too seriously. When I was a boy, it was the experience that mattered. My first divine experience had no obvious intellectual content other than the conviction I had at the time, which was that what people called death didn't exist. That came to me when I was 5, and it was wonderful.
Wow.
But you can't give that a name. Was that a Gnostic experience? Did I experience Satori? 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 Did I experience Satori? I don't know. All I know is when I read descriptions of other people's so-called Satori, it was very damn similar. And there you go. Call it what you will. Call it gnosis. Call it. Does it have a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet.
Correct. I'm wondering though,
have I sort of covered your general idea about what I think about these terms?
Absolutely, and it's good to tie it into an over. It was a good spot coming out of that consciousness, sort of overly intellectualizing sort of way of approaching things, whereas gnosis, is something illuminating that again we're going back to a supra-rational sort of type of knowing.
Yeah, Jimi Hendrix is a Gnostic. Let's put it that way. John Lennon, when he was inspired, was a Gnostic.
Yes.
And the Beatles always were. Well, perhaps not always, but I'm not sure. Always there's a kind of Gnostic edge around the whole thing. It certainly got Timothy Leary overexcited and started to see them sadly in messianic terms. We don't need that sort of messianic labeling of human personalities. The point was the inspiration that came through them at certain times is something that comes through everybody, and they were the first to say this.
Yeah.
Love is all you need.
Yes. I'm wondering if those experiences that you had early on, did they transform you at any time into a practitioner of any sort?
My whole life is practitioner, and this is what I've never really understood about it. You don't have to draw a magic circle and wave fiery pentagrams in your personal temple to be practicing God awareness at all. But I suppose those I've never been. It's sort of aesthetics, really. I've never been one for ritual. I get bored with any kind of ritual. I don't like systems that rely too much on memory. That ritual, a large part of ritual is memory and habit. You do it enough, and it becomes easier, and so forth. I'm not the ritual type. I put all my practitioner into perception. Now, whether that's a good idea or not, I'm not sure. I sometimes have a need to go and participate, say, in a communion service at the church, where somebody else is doing all the work, really, and I get the pleasure of listening and interpreting, agreeing, disagreeing, volunteering myself, whatever. I'm an active participant. I'm not just I don't like to be in the audience. I actually want to be on stage, if you like. I think some people need, I presume, they need some sort of ritual affirmation. The other thing a lot of people need is the company of other people who they feel are like-minded. Yes. And quite right, because loneliness is a drag. It's just that my personal life has been involved with hugely long periods of aloneness. Sometimes loneliness, but mostly aloneness, because the writer's life is an alone life. Even though I can write in a crowded room, even if the noise is as long as the spirit in the room is good, I can write and hear my own thoughts perfectly well in quite a noisy room. And I've done some of my best writing in some of the best bars in the world. And I love writing in bars where if there's a good vibe, I can do that. But the deepest writing definitely comes in silence. I do think there is a real connection between silence and God.
Well put. Wow. I heard a quote that you we're coming to the end here. I've got my canned question for you coming up soon. But one thing that struck me, I was watching an interview with you maybe like 2 years ago or something to that effect, and I recently went back and found this quote. I don't know if you were quoting somebody else or if it was an original thing, but you said, "Truth is an unwelcome guest at the table of the world." So I
Yes,
wanted
one of
to ask,
mine. Yes, that's
so
one of
amazing,
mine.
amazing. I mean, that should be put on somebody on a tombstone or a family crest or something like that. But it's what sort of truth are you after in your investigations?
Well, the truth that validates my existence and that of everything else, and makes it possible to live in a world where there is this terrible continual struggle with evil.
Well said. Do you have anything forthcoming that you want to mention or talk about or plug?
I got a book coming out. If you since you asked that question,
Yeah.
it comes out in March. It's called The Books of Enoch Revealed. The
Mm.
Books of Enoch Revealed, and it's the first comprehensive study of the three books of Enoch, and most people have heard of the Book of Enoch. Well, the Book of Enoch is made of parts, but there are also subsequent works that use Enoch. I think I go into areas that no one's ever gone to before. I learnt things in the process that are important. But what it does is it does several things. But one of the things it does is it covers all of the scholarly work that's been done on this since the first century AD, right up to all the contemporary scholarship. You won't find this level of concentrated scholarship in any other book. This is a fact. So you talk about being a trustworthy book. You hear many points of view in the book, but you will also hear an amazing. It is an incredible story. I wanted to plug it, if that's the right word. I don't like that word at all, actually. I wanted to present it as giving a very, very strong insight into the origin of Jesus's teaching and his worldview. I think he was very much acquainted with the content of the Enochic writings. And I think the world of Second Temple Judaism is vital to understand the origins of Christianity. Absolutely vital. And I think the book bears this out. But also, I discovered, if that's the right word, I mean, we're not talking. I was digging in the desert and found. I was digging in the desert of the material, as it were, and found that it seems to me that the Hermetic writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which I spoke of earlier that I like very much, were in fact a response of Greco-Egyptian people, of intellectual Egyptian Gnostics. They are responding to the Enochic writings. I think that I suspect strongly that the Jews had Enoch first, and the Greco-Egyptian philosophers came up with their own version, which is Hermes Trismegistos, the thrice great Hermes. Hermes is the messenger who communicates to man the gnosis of God. That is exactly the role that Enoch has. And I think the missing name of, when people said, "Who is Jesus?" Who do men say that I am? And I think at Caesarea Philippi, and somebody says, some say you're Elijah, some say so and so, and it says in one of the Gospels, and some say another, or one of the other. Well, I think they would definitely have said, "You're Enoch." If John the Baptist was Elijah returned, Jesus, Yeshua ben Yosef certainly conforms to the return of Enoch, because Enoch is taken out of the world in Genesis because he walks with God, meaning he conforms to the divine pattern. And along comes Yeshua from a mysterious beginning, but he rises up at the end. This is all in the Enochic mythology. I think the book, understood by intelligent people, could be revolutionary. A silent revolution of understanding would be nice. I think it may be. I don't know what's my most important work, but it feels to me like it was worth living this long to write that particular work.
Oh,
So
that must
I'm
be a
sorry,
wonderful feeling.
sorry to make such a meal of that.
No. That's great. I'm looking forward to it, to be honest with you. I mean, this is, I'm sure many people are looking forward to that work. But on the subject of books, obviously, I have a canned question that everybody gets at the end of our conversation. We've covered a lot of ground here, as we tend to do. For anybody listening today that was interested in any of the things we talked about, whether that's Rosicrucianism, Hermetism, Gnosticism, could you recommend 3 books that would assist the listener in going a little deeper? You can list your own.
Well, I've tried in my life. I've 28 books published now and commissioned. I wanted to cover everything that I thought was not done very well by other writers. So if you'll forgive me, I will mention my own books. I think if you want a good book on Rosicrucianism, you cannot get a better text than the Invisible History of the Rosicrucians, as the American publisher wanted to call it. It wasn't my title. I called it Invisibles because I want to talk about the general idea. I want to imply there's a general notion of the invisible. But they took that, and it becomes the Invisible History of the Rosicrucians, which is sort of slightly paradoxical title. But anyway, never mind that. It's the best introduction you will find to the facts and the texts and the authentic spiritual message of the people associated with the real movement in the 16th and 17th centuries. I think my book is called The Lost Pillars of Enoch. If you are interested in how different traditions have interpreted this ancient knowledge and how they really have something profound in common, that we can call, I'm quite happy to call it the Gnostic tradition. Come up with another name if you will. Spiritual knowledge, it's just, I'd say Gnostic is perfectly valid. It's what we're talking about. I'm sure that a gnosis was what the Buddha was teaching, and I'm sure it's a gnosis that the great spiritual teachers, Plato, that's what they're offering, is a path to spiritual being, or we can say a path back to it, if you like. Why will be another interesting idea? Why do we always go back to the child? The child motif is so strong in all these traditions. Krishna as a child, Jesus as a baby, the Gospel of Judas, Jesus appears as a child. That's quite a common motif in Gnostic writings. I remember writing in my mid-teens, why is it so to my childhood I go when I want to know the truth? The magic of the Beatles was the summoning up again of childlike consciousness. You also get that in the early Pink Floyd. The pleasure in mythology, the pleasure in fantasy, the pleasure in what some will call fairy stories or children's stories. I think that the ultimate story is a children's story.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I'm looking forward to your next book and everything else that you've got for us in the future, as I'm sure all my listeners are. It's been a great honor and pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much.
I've enjoyed it hugely, and thank you for your sympathetic questioning.